Arbiters Grounds in Twilight Princess. The only way to describe it would be a towering coliseum, an area that should feel scary atmospherically as you take your first steps into the building, but instead you feel as if the expanse deserves reverence. Something this grand in nature couldn't possibly have fallen victim to the Twilight and the monsters that came with it. As the hero of Twilight ventures into the labyrinth, he has no idea of the horrors that await him at the end of this structure. This is the opening to my favourite dungeon in the series. It's one of the few in the entirety of the timeline that had something go down in them that actually means something for Link when he ventures into the depths of whichever temple he's exploring. Before the events of the game take place, this was the prison that was meant to lock Ganondorf away. The very same villain that the hero of time fought years before. The prison itself was built to house the most ruthless of criminals throughout Hyrule. Some even theorise that this prison could have been in the very same building, or could have at least been inspired, by the Spirit Temple from Ocarina of Time. I'm one of the people that actually believes this could be the case. Anyway, whilst the sages try to lock Ganondorf in the Twilight Realm, the Demon King begins to release himself from his shackles using his third of the Triforce, therefore using the Triforce of Power. The sages begin to sense this power and attempt to lock him away faster, though it's already too late. Ganondorf mortally wounds one of the sages and the rest of them lock him away with haste. The Arbiters Grounds is, in a sense, where this story began. Without this crucial event happening, the rest of the game doesn't happen. Link makes his way through the prison to attain the Mirror of Twilight, after defeating one of my favourite bosses in the series, Star-Lord. He makes his way to the top of the jail before noticing the mirror has been broken. The hero learns of where the pieces of the mirror may have gone and sets off once again, one piece of the Mirror of Twilight heavier. Ever since that day, or technically since the end of Twilight Princess, the Arbiter's Grounds has just sat there, presumably being repurposed for something else. Or was it? Surely it isn't possible that the Gerudo and by extension the Hylians left that building to wither and rot there? While the area isn't seen in any of the other games in the series, save for a couple of spin-offs in both Hyrule Warriors and Link's crossbow training, but that's to be expected. So with the area not making any appearances on the rest of the timeline, meaning just in Four Swords Adventures down to Twilight Princess's placement in the timeline, we can deduce that, yeah, the races of Hyrule let the building presumably just collapse down. Why would they do this? I don't really know, but I do know one thing. The Arbiter's Grounds have only appeared in one other game in the entire series. That game is Breath of the Wild. I didn't know this location existed for years after the game's release, but it is here, and it's one of the most interesting locations in the game to me. Most of the locations in Breath of the Wild were named things just for the sake of referencing stuff, or canonically to remember people who helped Hyrule in the past, or for some reason Termina. But the point is that all of these locations weren't actually the same as in previous games, barring obvious inclusions like Death Mountain, Zora's Domain, and other staples that have been in almost every game in the series to date. Arbiter's Grounds and one more in Spectacle Rock are the anomalies here, at least out of the ones that I can think of off the top of my head. More so Arbiter's Grounds since the developers had to actively craft such a small area just to reference a single dungeon from a past game, whereas Spectacle Rock is used as a mountain and a landmark for the Gerudo. So why is Arbiter's Grounds in Breath of the Wild in the first place? Well, it really depends on your own subjective opinion. Someone who's not as much of a conspiracy theorist may say that they put it in the game as a neat little reference, especially since there are ruins that look almost identical to this scattered around the Gerudo Desert, and honestly that's a very valid way of thinking. But now that we have a sequel on the horizon, I think that the Zelda team will see that callback and could very well be putting it in Breath of the Wild 2 as an explorable area. When it comes down to it, we've seen very little on the sequel, overall around 2.5 minutes. In this time, the most prevalent theme has been the sky, with the first look at the game ending with Hyrule Castle slowly being lifted off the ground. And 2 years later, we saw the continuation of this little mini storyline thing, as we once again saw the castle lifted from its former spot and floating around, this time much closer and with far more details. Ever since then, it's been theorised that other places in the map might also be lifted out of the ground. My personal opinion, if this theory turns out to be a fact, is that we could see Ganondorf picking and choosing which places to throw out from the earth. Here's where things get a little wacky though. Another theory that's been thrown around the Breath of the Wild sequel room since the reveal has been the discussion of whether or not Breath of the Wild 2's Ganondorf is the same as Twilight Princess's Ganondorf. Before I get into this section of the video, let me say that this is theory stuff mixed with speculation, meaning not all of it is 100% solid, and I'm just here to talk about the next game rather than trying to figure out and theorise every little thing, and you'll see a lot of that a little later on. Back to Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild Ganondorf similarities for now though. There are stark similarities here, not to mention design choices in Twilight Princess that link to Breath of the Wild. Let's run through these similarities pretty damn quickly. We have fang-like teeth in both of these designs, though Twilight Princess has 2 less it looks like. We have a jewel locked into the top of both of their heads mixed with the same design of the patents holding the jewel. The same red hair, just longer in the trailer for the next game. New Ganon's head snap feels oddly fitting for someone who died due to a broken neck, and Breath of the Wild's Ganon is an amazing magic user, as we've seen through Calamity Ganon, something he conjured up in his sleep. While he was never on this level, thousands of years of sleep, and presumably sat in his own mind, could train Twilight Princess's Ganondorf to become an even better magic user, and he was already a really damn good one considering he told Zant he could revive him, though he never made good on that promise. One problem with this is the addition of Gerudo jewellery, but I think this may have been added by Gerudo admirers much later down the line. One of the biggest pieces of evidence for these Ganondorfs being linked in some nature is Twilight Princess Ganondorf sporting an eerily similar symbol on the collar to his badass armor thing. Some say that this is the symbol of the Zonai, but for the sake of keeping the video concise, I'll just say that this symbol is everywhere in Breath of the Wild if you're looking in the right places. Not to mention, this symbol is visually identical to the fire-breathing weapon utilised by the hero of the Wild in the newest trailer for the next game. Honestly, the theory that this Ganondorf is the same seen in both Twilight Princess and Ocarina of Time, and technically all of the other parts of the timeline, isn't that far-fetched if you believe the theory that there have only been 1 or maybe even 2 different Ganon or Ganondorfs throughout the course of the timeline. Not to mention, the seal used in the next game's villain is in a very similar position to that of the villain of Twilight's final blow. Perhaps the sages found Ganondorf's body after the events of the battle that took place between the hero and him in Hyrule Field, and had an inkling and knew that the cycle would continue if they didn't do something, so they tried to seal him away. This worked for a time, but the first seal broke around the time of the battle 10,000 years before Breath of the Wild. There is one problem with this mini-theory though. Four Swords Adventures takes place between Twilight Princess and Breath of the Wild, and Ganondorf is reincarnated in that game, which means the seal wouldn't have worked, ultimately meaning the sages would have killed the mummified Ganondorf. Honestly, as I write this, I've been looking around for the past hour and racking my brain around whether or not there's some loophole that could counter this, but I can't think of one to save my life. The only one I've come close to really grasping at is that the Zelda team has been very tight-lipped about where Breath of the Wild fits when it comes to the entirety of the timeline, telling us that the game sits at the very end of the timeline. Maybe there's the smallest chance it's set between both Twilight Princess and Four Swords Adventures, but even then a lot of evidence points to the games being set at the bottom of the timeline due to things like the Koroks, the Rito, the Zora, and much more we don't have time to get into. One other reason could be that they might want to retcon Four Swords Adventures' placement on the timeline, which a lot of people have told me is a very feasible option considering some theories made up by Twitter users and other users, shown on screen right now. And honestly, it seems pretty darn likely to me that they would retcon Four Swords Adventures. Some people think Ganondorf in the last couple of trailers could be the Four Swords Adventures incarnation of the king, down to the mural in the first tease showing him wielding a trident. Though in Ganon form he's always used a trident no matter where you look. Even though he hasn't really used it in the child timeline split, the one that matters since we're specifically asking if it's Twilight Princess Ganondorf. So maybe it'd be Ganondorf from another split rather than just Twilight Princesses? Anyway, let's move forward so that we can get back on track. For now, let's go ahead with the assumption that somehow these Ganondorfs, both Twilight Princesses, or technically the rest of the series, and Breath of the Wild, are one and the same. Then it's likely that when Link is one of the first things he sees after waking up from a 10,000 year long slumber down to another version of the hero, he wouldn't be too pleased. Down to the mental drain that the foe would be feeling after such experiences, our Ganondorf may feel like rising up areas that have great importance to him. One of these areas in the original map would be Arbiters Grounds. As stated earlier in the video, it's where this Ganondorf's life would have gone from bitter to really sour. Seeing Link have to suffer in that infernal place would be sufficient punishment to Ganondorf, especially if the Demon King could lock the hero in one of the abandoned cells and torture him just as he'd been tortured for the countless years before the events of the next game. I know we've talked an awful lot about lore this video, more so than I usually get into in the channel, way more. So let's get back and view the Zelda series as a series of games and nothing more now. Another reason why I think we'll be getting Arbiters Grounds as a dungeon in the next game is pretty simple when compared to that last giant point. The Zelda team love callbacks, not to mention Arbiters Grounds in of itself being a callback to the Spirit Temple. And with all of this in mind, there's one final thing. Usually we get some sort of desert dungeon in these games. Even in Breath of the Wild, one of the less conventional games in the series, we were given Vanna Boris, a desert or electricity themed beast. I think it's safe to assume that there will be a desert themed dungeon in the next game, With that in mind, and considering we know there'll be a usual overworld in Breath of the Wild 2, and likely a set of Sky Islands and whatever else the Zelda team cook up, I can't imagine the desert themed dungeon being found in the Sky Islands unless the Arbiters Grounds are one of those dungeons. It will likely be in the pre-existing world around the Gerudo province, and with that said, that is yet another reason why I think Arbiters Grounds will be in the next game, though these are just theories and overall speculation. I actually talked about Ganondorf a whole lot in this video. Initially it was going to be just about the Arbiters Grounds, but apparently I had a whole ton to say about a certain Demon King. I know a lot of the theory bits bordered on just speculation, but considering that's what the rest of the channel is, I hope you didn't mind too much. Anyway, here are some other thoughts on Ganondorf and Arbiters Grounds in Breath of the Wild 2. Follow my Twitter to have the chance to be up on screen here next week, and that's down in the description, and as always, you guys have amazing ideas. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed them, please do support me by leaving a like rating and subscribing as we wait for more Breath of the Wild 2 news. And you'll join the 13% of people who are subscribed. You'll also get even more content, so thank you a ton if you do. The people you can see on screen right now are my Patreon supporters. Thank you all so much for the support, guys. Sumji and Jared Whedon are especially amazing for being my top paying patrons. Now just look at the Triforce coloured names and that Triforce font. Thank you so much for the support. If you'd like to join them, then you can do for as little as £1 or $1.50 a month. The link to my Patreon is in the description, and along with that link is the link to the rest of my media platforms, so follow me on them to keep in touch with me. I hope you enjoyed, and most likely I'll see you on Sunday. But for now, Trenders, please do stay safe.